Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals on what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsintensive.com. In today's interview, I interview Tammy Sollenberger. Tammy is a licensed clinical mental health counselor and an internal family systems certified supervisor. She holds a master in arts in marriage and family counseling from the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. As a community support therapist in a community mental health center, she worked with adults who struggled with mental health illness. Tammy received her clinical mental health license in 2007 and shifted to a group therapy practice where she saw both adolescent and adult clients. In 2011, she began her own private practice. Tammy is the producer and host of the One Inside podcast. She's interviewed Dick Schwartz and Frank Anderson, two of the IFS leaders, and she's covered topics including befriending your inner critic, parenting, addiction, shame, and more. So without further ado, here's my interview with Tammy. Well, Tammy, thanks for being on the Mind of a Therapist podcast today. We were just talking before I hit record, and on your Zoom waiting message board, break room, whatever it's called, waiting room, you have a message that says, waiting isn't any fun, so, feel free to check in with your parts. And I love that. I wanted to mention that because I think, waiting is no fun. I mean, I don't really like going to amusement parks for that reason because there's so much waiting in lines. But this is nice because it's an opportunity then to check in with our parts. So,
Yeah, and what usually happens with waiting, so this would be just a sort of a fun kind of invitation, right? Like if I'm waiting nowadays, what do? I grab my phone. I get
Yes.
on social media. I
Yes.
check my email. I read through my texts. I look at my pictures. Like I don't just sit there, right? I don't check inside. I don't see sort of how am I feeling today? Let me think about my day. Let me just consider, or let me look around at the pine trees or the snow, or just sort of just be. Like, can I just be right here? Like, we're driving and texting or, ordering off of Amazon while we're driving. Like, and that's so, what happens when we're bored, right? Because we don't really allow ourselves to get bored. We're standing in the grocery store and you look around, everyone's on their phones, like while we're just standing in line. So, so I have this invitation because I'm always running a few minutes late. And so I have this invitation to just check in with your parts, just check inside. Sort of our attention is always outside, right? I'm always focused on you and my son and my house and what's happening, what needs to be done, and my list and da 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 da. So I'm focused outside. So what happens when I just focus inside to my heart, to my body, to my feelings, to my mind, to the story I'm telling myself about myself, the story I'm telling myself about you, the story I'm telling myself about whoever I'm interacting with. Yeah, what happens when I just turn that attention inside and just notice and just sort of feel what it feels like just to slow down enough just to notice what's happening inside.
Yeah. Well, that's so nice. And I love that part about IFS and mindfulness practices. Each moment, each day, we have so many opportunities to thicken the connection with ourselves, with our experience. And I think the more we practice that, it increases our ability to connect with those around us. And I think most people, that's a part of their goal or mission, is to thicken that connection with people around them, maybe the tasks that they're doing or other living things. So that's nice.
Yeah. I love that. So if that is our goal, right? Say if the people listening and you and I, like, my goal is to thicken that connection, connection to the divine, the connection to myself, the connection to the earth. That feels like a beautiful goal, of like a life goal. So what gets in the way of that? Because we're not living that way.
Yeah.
That's not how I'm living. That's not how I live today. So what gets in the way of that? Well, that's when I can look at my parts. because there's me that really wants to live that way, live connected, live in more presence. Yeah, that feels really good, right? And we all have different words for what that means, right? Whatever that means, to slow down, to be more aware, to be more mindful. Okay, so what gets in the way of that? Because something's happening because we're not living that way in general. So then I can look towards my parts, the part of me that is too busy, the part of me that has too many things on my to-do list, the part of me that says, you have to redo such and such because it's not perfect. If you have perfect, perfectionistic parts, sort of the part of me that kind of gets in the way, which I'm using in quote unquotes, the part of me that gets in the way of living that's slower. Like I said to my partner last night, I said, I really just want to live as like sort of a hippie. There's nothing really super hippy dippy about me, but I'm like, I really just want to live more hippy dippy. Like I just want it, like that vibe is like that's kind of what I'm going for. And he was like, what keeps you from doing that? Like, why can't you live that way now? And I'm like, right, well, that's my parts. Like the parts of me that say, yeah, so I think that's the thing, is that I can really, and we all have different parts that kind of get in our way, but they're not getting in the way. They're helping us. That's the idea of IFS, is these parts aren't getting in the way, and the goal isn't just to get rid of them. The goal is to turn towards them and befriend them. And I can find out, okay, the part of me that puts way too much for one person to actually do today. Like I had a full day of clients. I'm talking to you. And I had part that was like, I needed to finish up stuff with the podcast. I answered about 100 emails in between clients. And I had a guy here painting my house. And I had two dogs that I had to take out. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Like that's not the hippy dippy life I'm going for here. So who was that part? Like who inside of me is driving me like that? And then if I can turn towards them with some curiosity, what are they afraid would happen if it didn't like keep me that busy and that like on task?
Yeah.
Like, what if I waited? Like, what if I waited and did stuff later? What if I waited and did stuff tomorrow? And I can hear the part say, well, you have other things to do later. Well, you have other things to do tomorrow, right? Like,
Uh-huh.
and so, but I could listen, I could really listen and find out, what's going on, but not in a critical way or a shaming way, which is how we usually talk to ourselves, right? What's wrong with me? But more in an open, compassionate, what's going on?
Yeah. And I'm hearing this is a practice for you on a daily basis of tuning into these parts even today, noticing this part of you that's so focused on checking everything off the list and doing all of the things, and then this other part that is wanting you to be a hippie and live slowly, maybe like my hippie part, just go off in the woods in a cabin, and just be connected to the natural world.
Yeah. I'm like, I wanna go on. All right. So this is a great. So I have a big birthday coming up in a couple of weeks, and I have a part of me that wants to jump out of a plane. I'm like, that sounds amazing. I want to jump out of a plane. People tend to jump out of planes at this big birthday. That's the thing that people do. So I'm like,
Oh.
okay, I could do that. And then I have another part that wants to go on a silent retreat.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that sounds right, right? Sort of there's a part of me, and I honestly think that I will probably do both, probably not on the same day, but I think I could do both. But I think that really sort of describes exactly what I'm saying, right? Jump out of a part of me that wants to jump out of a plane, and part of me that's like actually, I think the thing that becomes sort of that creates disharmony in my system is they want to live that way all the time, right? The one that wants to go on a silent retreat is like, I want to be in that silent retreat mindset and lifestyle all the time. And then this one, which I'm using my hand, sort of one's in my right hand, one's in my left. And the one that wants to jump out of a plane is like, I want to live with that intensity. I want to live with like that fast all the time. And so then my true self, my grounded, calm, centered true self, I can ask some questions. Well, what's going on? Why does it feel like we have to live one way or the other all the time? Right. And I can ask and have conversations in a relationship with both of these parts. What is it about yeah, we can jump out of a plane, and yeah, we can go on a silent retreat. We can do that at different times. Why does it feel like I need to do that all the time? What
Yeah.
is that about?
Yeah. And I'm excited to talk more about that. And I realized I got ahead of myself. I usually ask the question about change at the beginning of the podcast, and I was so engaged. I want to track back to this, these two polarized parts that you're talking about. Ask a few more questions, but maybe we could just pause and I can ask you this question of how do you view change? So what we've talked about so far, and I've talked about on other podcasts with other IFS practitioners, are this concept of polarization. We're kind of talking about extreme protective parts going back and forth, maybe extreme firefighters, extreme managers who are wanting to run the show all the time. So amidst this, how whether these are addictive parts, whether these are parts that are overachievers, parts that want us to be small and hide, that keep us depressed. How do we help these parts change? How do we change? Be curious to hear your ideas around that.
Well, the first thing that comes up for me is there's a part that thinks that they need to change.
Mm.
That's what comes up for me, is that like they don't need to change, right? There's a part. So I would say, right, like if you and I were talking, or if I said, I want these parts to change, right? That jump out of the air, these polarized parts, jump out of the airplane, live in a silent, sort of do silent retreat, and both of those need to change. Well, that's a third part. So I would turn towards that part and say, okay, why does it feel like they need to change? And what would happen if they changed? And what would that look like if it changed? What would it give us? Again, sort of curious questions, and just see if I could get to know this part that says in quotes, I have to change in some way. Okay. So I'm curious about that. What does that mean to change? What does it look like to change? What would happen for me if I changed? Um, and then I would see if that part that needs me to change in some way or change a behavior, right? We're coming up on New Year's. And so we're all gonna make resolutions around change. And so, but that's a part that wants to change. For what reason? And then the idea too is that um the parts are doing the parts that aren't changing are doing that for a reason, right? Say the parts that are eating too much or drinking too much or not meditating or not going out in the woods, or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be, drinking too much, eating too much. It doesn't have to be that. It really could be sort of, I'm not doing the thing that I want to do. And so I want to do something really positive, right? I want to meditate more. I want to be more mindful. And um, so, can I just bring some curiosity to like, what's happening that change isn't happening, right? Like if I want to make a change, I'm hoping I'm saying this right, but like say if I want to change, I want to be on time, right? I want to change, I want to be on time. Okay, so then can I be curious about, so I want to deal with the part that wants to change, right? I want to get to know the part that wants to change. And then I want to bring some curiosity to the part that's struggling to be on time. What's happening for that part, right? Or like sort of the part that plays small. Well, let me bring some curiosity to how that's helping me, right? So it's not just forcing parts to change. It's finding out, how is that part protecting me? How is it helping me? What's its positive intention for me?
Yeah.
Because if I force parts to change, we're gonna get backlash, right? Like if I force myself to, not drink so much or whatever, not eat so much, there's gonna be backlash because these parts are protecting us in some way.
Yeah.
So that's why we can go from addiction to addiction, because we're just
Sure.
forcing these parts to just do something else. Does that make sense? Because they're sort of protecting us from something. So then, yeah.
It does. That makes sense, and that's something that's so common, right? If we stop using a certain substance or stop a certain addiction, then the addiction will often pop up just in another area. And so what I'm hearing you say is, when we're trying to change parts, uh, it's probably going to make things worse. If we're trying to force parts of us to change, uh, that change probably won't last, because what I'm hearing you say is, if we have that self energy, we have that compassion and curiosity about why we are reaching for the sugary treat, the donut, the whatever it is, then we can hold space for that part, and paradoxically, it's kind of that Rogerian, when I accept myself as I am, then I can truly change. Tracking with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is so the part that want the change I need to change as a part, right? So getting to know that part, befriending that part, and then the thing to be changed, finding out how that's trying to help me, right? Is it trying to soothe my emotions? Is it right, like sort of, is it bringing that compassion and bringing that acceptance to that, like this is here for a reason. Let me find out. Let me find out its story. Right? What's the story around the part of me that does this thing that other parts don't like? Right. Like, so a part of me does a thing or doesn't do a thing that other parts of my system don't like. And so, can I bring some curiosity? Like I myself bring some curiosity to find out what's going on. What's the story there? Because it's helping me. It thinks it's helping me in some way. And at some point in my life, it did. Right. Like at some point in my life, there was big feelings. I did this thing and it helped with the big feelings, or I felt shame and it helped with the shame.
Yeah.
Typically.
Sure. I'm I'm imagining someone listening right now who maybe isn't as familiar with this concept of parts and multiplicity, um, and like talking with their parts. They might be like, "What the heck? How do I talk with a part of me that's a part that's maybe addicted to something or whatever?" What does that generally look like? You talked about a number of times. Maybe what does it look like for you when you're talking with your parts, or when you're talking with these two parts that you were mentioning earlier that are kind of polarized, the one that wants to go skydiving on your birthday and the one that wants to do a silent retreat?
Yeah. Well, um, I get that can sound really weird, and sometimes IFS is so like sort of hokey sounding, but it is, we do it all the time. We have sort of self-talk and we have like dialogue in our head all the time. So just imagine that that's happening, but you're doing that really intentionally. Right. So I can even we sort of call it going inside. We call it going inside. And it's sort of I can go inside, I can turn my attention inward and I can just bring some curiosity, right? I can shut my eyes and just be like, okay, I can notice the part of me. Like, where is that part of my body that wants to jump out of a plane? I can feel its energy. I can feel what it feels like in my body. Or it might just be an idea in my head, right? I might not even be super embodied by it or with it. It can just be sort of an idea in my head. So I can put that attention right there on my head or in this sort of some energy. And then I can just ask, right? I can ask inside, like, what's going on? How are you trying to help me? What do what's your positive intention for me? And then I can just listen. And it sounds weird, but we all do it. We all do it. And we all can like just sort of even imagine something about you that bothers you or something about you that you want to change. And then imagine asking it with some curiosity. Hey, how are you trying to help me? What's your positive intention for me? And just see what happens. And sort of usually there'll be an answer. It's kind of weird and trippy, but I think it makes sense because I think we're having dialogue with ourselves all day long.
Yeah. And do you find with your own practice and your own experiences that that differs from person to person, that being that experience of talking to the part? For some people, is it more visual? Some is it more like auditory?
Yeah, I mean, I think and I know we're not probably going to talk about this today, but I think a lot of it's based on your Enneagram type, but sort of Enneagram is sort of like a personality type. I think a lot of it is based on that. Um, that's my hunch is it's based on that. But yeah, like sometimes I can really see my parts, right? I can imagine the part of me that wants to jump out of a plane, and I can imagine an image of a part. Let's sort of imagine these images of these parts of me. Sometimes they look like me, sometimes they look like cartoon characters, sometimes they sort of just look like made up, right? I can sort of have this sort of made up part jumping out of a plane and a made up part sort of at this little cabin, having a silent retreat. Um, And then but a lot of people, it's just sort of there's a thought, a sentence in your head, like a thought you would have, right? Like here's the thought, I'm an idiot. Okay, so I just notice the thought. Is there an image around the thought? No, it's just I'm an image. It's just thought. It's just a thought. Okay, so yeah, so we're gonna then check in with that thought, right? That part of you that has that thought, right? The part of you that has that thought, where I just really feel like I just feel depressed and sad and heavy, and I just feel it in my body, and that's all I'm getting, right? I'm not getting words, I'm not getting an image, it's just all in my body. Okay, so we're just gonna treat that as part that's showing up in your body that way, and let's see, how you're feeling towards it. Let's see if you can get in relationship with it, and then we can just find out, what can we find out about it.
Yeah, I'm hearing there's a lot of variety in how we can experience these parts, and probably differs, yeah, from person to person, and then probably within each person from moment to moment and part to part, and hearing it's visual at times, you hear story or voice, and also the bodily experience and emotional experience of the parts. And we don't need them to show up in any of those ways, but we're just kind of bringing that curiosity to the part as we're experiencing it.
Definitely. I mean, it's automatically happening. We're not making it happen. So, I'm really visual, but as I'm going throughout my day, I hear more words, right? Like I've been hearing a lot of like, you need to do something, you need to do something. And so I just wrote that down on like my piece of paper that I've got like 100 notes of things I need to do today. I write a P with a circle on it. I need to do something. So that part of me knows, hey, I hear you. I hear you. I can't attend to you right now. Like I'm seeing clients, I'm doing my thing. I can't really I can't give you attention, but I'm noticing you're here. And so I'm just going to note, and I'm going to write it down. P with a circle, you need to do something. And I write what it says. You need to do something. And our parts will say that you need to blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, okay. So the other way that I really like working with my parts is like journaling with them. Right. So if I journal, like I write a P, and I might write a P1, you need to do something. All right, what's my reaction to that, right? What am I noticing about that? And then I can just sort of do, and sometimes people do sort of left hand, right hand, or people can do different colors. But I just tend to sort of just what else comes up, and I just write. Um, and then I'll write with an S, an S with a circle for self. And usually that's sort of just, I hear you, I hear what you're saying, I understand, thank you for telling me. I'm right here with you. And that really, 5-minute journaling exercise like that brings so much calmness and centeredness in my system.
The power of putting those thoughts down on paper for your parts to be validated, and validated by the self, but also putting the P in what they're writing. That's powerful, isn't it?
It is. And the other thing that I'll notice too is I was triggered yesterday, and I had a break. And so I was like, okay, during my break, I really want to journal. And I found this part of me that was procrastinating, and I was doing all kinds of stuff. And then I sat down next to my computer, and I had 5 minutes until my client was coming. And I was like, okay, well, I guess you can journal now. And I was like, really? Like, so I did. I mean, I really did, like, took 5 minutes to journal, and but I found it funny. I was like, okay, so some part of me didn't. So I just noticed that, right? A part
Yeah,
of me did not want to do that, right? Like I knew I was triggered. I was upset, and I was just like, this other part of me was like, I don't want to feel this right now. I don't want to go inside. I don't want to notice this. I'm just going to be very distracted. And I just noticed that. Okay, yeah, there's a part of here that's really, and that's okay. I'm just
yeah,
noticing that a part of me is keeping me really distracted.
yeah. You talking about that distracting part is reminding me of my own distracting part, and how since I've been doing my own parts work, I've been doing a daily meditation practice, and I'm pretty consistent with it. Part of me is very disciplined, but there is another one that's come up that's like, no, don't do it. And so the last month or so, I've kind of been slipping out of that habit. And I'm so glad you just talked about your experience, because it's reminding me, okay, yeah, this is just more opportunity to connect with another part that's popping up. And that's like such a cool thing about IFS is it's like everything that happens is just more opportunity to connect with ourselves. And I think that's so counter to like so many other ways of thinking in our society that catalyze shame, because if it is this, and that's why I've been drawn always to the work of Carl Rogers, the unconditional positive regard. It's just it's so counter to shame to like hold space for all of our experience. Like there's not a right or wrong experience we have, and just holding space and like connecting inwards is it's such a like a powerful practice. And so anyways, I you made me think of that as you were talking there.
That's such a good point. So in IFS, we call them trailheads, right?
Mm.
So I use the word trigger, but we don't really use the word trigger. We call them trailheads. So a trailhead, the idea is, you're driving. I live in New Hampshire. There's trails everywhere, probably the same in Oregon, right? There's hiking trails everywhere. So, the idea is that a trailhead is sort of the beginning of a trail. I might not see where it's going. I can just see there's woods and there's a path. That's all I really see. And it's a trailhead. I start walking down this trail, and maybe it leads to a summit of a mountain. Maybe it leads to a waterfall. Maybe it just sort of leads just a nice walk in the woods back to the parking lot. I don't really know, right? I'm not really sure. Um, and so we call them trailheads because, yeah, I mean, I could have been, because what typically would happen, right, is you're mad at the part of you that's so distracted. And then, darn it, I'm disciplined. I think of myself as a disciplined person. I'm disciplined. I've been doing a part meditation practice every day. And now I'm not doing it. I suck. I'm so stupid. I don't. So then these are our parts, right? I don't ever follow through with anything. What's wrong with me? I might as well quit. Blah, 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 blah. Then I'll be like, then I would be like, now I'm going to go eat some cookies because I
Yeah.
suck, right? Like that's
For
sort of
me, it would be
where
donuts.
what's your favorite donut?
Oh, that's a hard question. Probably a maple bar, though.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one.
Sorry, I distracted
Yeah,
you.
that's good. I know. I have food distraction parts there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what would happen, right?
Yeah.
And so what IFS says, and what you just said really beautifully, is let me turn my attention towards the part of me. There's the part that wants to meditate, the part that's not meditating, right? There's two parts, part that wants to meditate, part that's not doing it, and then the part that has a whole lot of opinions about me not doing it. Right. And that's where the shame comes in. It's like all those, and then there's the donut eater, which is now your fourth part, right? So we've got one that wants to meditate, one that's not doing it, and one that says you suck and you're awful and la 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 la. And then we've got the donut eater. That's the firefighter that just takes care of everything, right? It wipes the slate clean. Now we don't have to feel anything. And then we have other parts that respond to that. But that's that donut eater just takes care of all that shame for us.
Yeah. It's so amazing how one part how the it's internal family systems, right? It's such a fitting name that Dick named this way of thinking, because it is this internal world, an internal family, and there's so much connection amongst the parts. And I think this conversation is really illuminating that, and that's really nice. I wanted to ask you. So you're the podcast host of the One Inside podcast, and you've interviewed like some of the leading practitioners and thinkers in the IFS world, and I wanted to ask you, uh, as you look back at the interviews you've done, it, are there any that stick out? Maybe not the whole interview, but any like parts of interviews that were just deeply resonant for you that have really stuck with you, um, personally?
Yeah, such a good question. The only thing that comes to mind, two things come to mind. One is I've had Dick on, I think, three times. So Dick's the founder of IFS, and I've had him on three times. And we, for the 100th episode, which was about 2.5 years ago, we were just chatting. So I just start recording as soon as people get on. I start recording, and him and I were just chatting, and his dog had just died, and
Mm.
I was about to go through a divorce, and so we were just chatting about all that. And he said, well, do you want to do a piece of work? Do you want to do, we can do a piece of work around what you're talking about. And I was like, well, yeah, of course. Do I want to do a piece of you? Do I want Dick to be my therapist? Sure, of course.
Yeah.
And so we did this beautiful piece of work on, so we did a therapy session, and then afterwards we talked about it a little bit, and I published it as a podcast
Hmm.
episode. So
Was
so
there a
that was
piece
really
of
powerful.
that work with him that in particular, as you're talking about it, really stands out to you as a particularly moving moment?
I wish I could remember, and I love that you think I could remember
Or maybe not that
something that
remembering the
happened.
details exactly, but maybe something just even as you're talking about that you're feeling or
I think the kindness and compassion and warmth of Dick,
hmm,
um that when we were having a really personal, like, I cut out a bunch of it so that for him and for me, so you don't really hear that, but that just like it didn't really matter that we were there to do a podcast, right? It wasn't like he was like, oh, this is happening for you, let's I can help you in this way, right? And it was, so that I think that's what, for my parts that are like so efficient and like, okay, no, we're doing a podcast, right? Like, no, we can't do that. We have to do this job, right? We have to do this job and get this thing done. And I think for him to be like, that doesn't matter right now, what really matters is you. And like feeling like he cared about me. And so I think there's something in my system. It's not about him, but there's some part of me that feels like, because I can feel a little teary around it. Like the idea that so much of what happens in our lives isn't really about that person, right? It's not really about Dick. It's about wow, there's someone that sees me. This is what it is. There's someone that sees me enough to take some time with me. And that feels like something that maybe my system didn't get. Right? That
mm,
feels like something that like my younger parts didn't really get a lot of that. And so that feels like a gift to be seen, and to be seen vulnerably, not to be seen because I have a podcast and I wrote a book and blah, 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 but to be seen in my vulnerability, and not to be, okay, so this is the next part of it, to be seen in my vulnerability and to say, that's welcome here. I'm not going to say you're sensitive. I'm not going to shame you. I'm going to say, actually, tell me more. Yeah, that's what feels like so precious to me. And that has happened. That just happened this week on a podcast. We're talking about something else, and I started talking about my son, and the person, we sort of stopped and we had this really precious moment, and I felt seen and I felt cared about, not just because I'm a podcast host, not just because I'm doing this job, but she was like, I really care about you
mm,
and this moment, right? So we took 3 minutes. And so I think that's it.
mm. So there's yeah this part of you that the achieving one that's saying we let's focus on the task at hand, the podcast. Let's produce a podcast that is looks like this maybe, and in with Dick and this other podcast guest, they were like, what's important is that I show you care and I really listen to you, and that was it really touched. I'm hearing this like these little parts of you that like maybe didn't get there's like certain needs met growing up, and so it was just really like touching in that
Yeah.
moment for those parts to receive that from those people.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's nice. Yeah, I noticed as you were talking that for me, like my little exile too has started to feel him behind my eyes, and it's just like it's so touching when someone just holds that space and like I see you, I care about you, you're you're important, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, I'm curious what happened for you. I think for me it's these parts, and I again, I don't know that this is true, but my system really feels like people are only accepting and loving me if I'm nice and funny and happy. Right? Like nice and funny and happy. That's what's acceptable. That's why we love you, because you're this. If you're not that, then we don't want to see you. We don't want you around. I don't even want to see you. If you're not that, I don't want to see you.
Uh,
And and no one ever explicitly told me that, right? But my parts picked that up non-verbally,
yeah.
throughout my whole life. I mean, even at the grocery store, right? If I'm like smiley and happy and look cute, the person responds really nice. And I have a great grocery store experience. If I'm
Mm,
sick and I don't feel well, I have a very different grocery store experience. That
mm,
is the stupidest example, but it is
uh,
very true. It's very true.
yeah. That somewhere along the way, a part of you developed this understanding that if you aren't happy-go-lucky, then that, I mean, it's just not okay. You need to be happy-go-lucky, because if you are, then others will, you know, maybe treat you well, meet your needs, acknowledge you have a more positive experience in the world.
Yeah, it almost feels like as you say that, what I hear safe. I'm
Ah,
safe in the world, right? So this feels like very exile, very, exile is those young parts of us that really hold beliefs and trauma and shame, and they would be concerned about safety, right? So if little kids aren't safe, they die, right? They need to be safe, and so it really feels like to my system, that is safety, and not in sort of like. We all talk about sort of like shame is become, sort of this buzzword, and safety become a buzzword too, but to our younger parts, this idea of safety is like a life or death safety. So it feels like that's in my system. It's sort of like, and this is such a silly example, but it really feels this way, that like at the grocery store, the way the grocery store person is responding to me, one feels safe and one feels shamey.
mm. This core part of you feels either safe or shamey in this experience at the grocery store. It's safe if you are in this happy, fun disposition, or more of shame if you were feeling sick, under the weather. You didn't. That protector maybe wasn't as active. The one that stays happy, and is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience, because I think that that's what connects
Uh,
most with people. That's how we connect with each other. And um, uh, I had I had a few other questions. Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you too. How What was the impetus for you in the first place to, one, get into internal family systems and really invest in the model, and two, and maybe this is just the same answer, but to start your podcast, solely focused on IFS.
yeah. So I went to a workshop. I was a therapist. Uh, I had done DBT and was trained in DBT. And I went to a workshop, a kids therapy workshop, and this woman said something about, what if we were more curious about our clients, something, something. I don't know. I don't even know what she said, but she said something about being more curious. And I thought, it just stood out to me. And I thought, well, wow, what if I was more curious about my client's behavior, right? Talk about change, right? DBT is about changing thoughts, changing behavior. So what if I was more curious about their thoughts? What if I was more curious about their behavior? And then wait a minute, what if I was more curious about my own thoughts and behavior? But that felt like a dramatically different way I had learned to do therapy, right? We challenge thoughts, we work on changing behavior, or we work hard to accept behavior. But what if I just was curious? And that was like, I mean, that just even in my system right now feels like completely different, right? If I'm curious about my distractibility, if I'm curious about my procrastination, that just feels like an opening. Um, and then she mentioned IFS, which I had never heard of before. And at that time, it had been around for 20 plus years. But Dick had, later I found out like Dick had moved to Boston. So he's from Chicago. And so then he had moved to Boston. And so he had just started getting really big in Boston because he moved here and a couple other reasons. But so I went back to my office and I Googled IFS and read all about it. And then I ended up doing a training with Dick, like a week long training, just sort of a very, very intro. And it was sort of like that. Um, And there was a couple of demos and a couple of experientials. And in some of the experientials, like I'm working on my own stuff, and there was like sobbing. I was sobbing, snot running down my face. Like I've never done that before, right? I have a master's degree. I've done therapy before. I'd been in the field, 10 years at that time. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And then afterwards, I just had this lightness and I felt different. And I was just like, I need more of this. So in IFS, we say we need to do therapy, right? So I founded a local IFS therapist and started seeing her and doing my own work. Started doing my own work and then did a level one training. They were easier to get to do back then. So I did a level one training up in Maine. Um, and then I just continued. I fell in love with it. So I just continued I did a level one training and then I presented at the conference that year. And at the same time, a friend of mine was talking about podcasts. And he was talking about how podcasts are popular all over the world because people don't need to read English, right? You don't need to be able to read English. There's so many people around the world like know English, but they don't know how to read it. So we're talking about books and podcasts. I think we were sitting on the beach and he was just sort of this brainy guy and he was talking about this. And I was like, that's really interesting. And at the same time, I have a friend that does like a local friend, like she does a health podcast. I have two friends that do marriage podcasts. It's just sort of, it just kept coming up. It was just sort of like, this is all around me. I don't know if this has happened to you before, but sort of like everyone is now talking about this. It was just really like kind of weird, but like serendipitous. Um, and so I started asking around. So at the conference, I started asking around, like, is there an IFS podcast? Like, are we in that world? And we weren't. And so, yeah, sort of yeah, yada, yada, yada. I started an IFS podcast. And then I ended up finding out that there was someone that had started doing it, and her name is Beth Rogerson, and she had started an IFS podcast. And so I started with being on her podcast. That was the first thing I did. And she was stopping it. She was starting to do other things. And yeah, so then I started it. And then, I mean, I really think the my heart around it was to make IFS more accessible. Because I was like, I've never heard of this before. I've never heard about this idea that we have parts, that we have this self that is who we are. I've never heard of that before. And the people I'm hanging around with, they listen to podcasts. That's what they're doing, right? We all have little kids at the time and we're pushing strollers and we're smart moms and we're educated and we're all listening to podcasts. So as we clean our house and we parent because we're parenting little ones at the time. And so it just felt like this is a way to kind of get this message out into the world in a different way.
Hmm. I think it's such a service uh, to the world, to people who are consuming podcasts, because the work you're doing, the work that Dick has done on being in the podcast space, has brought these ideas, and I think that's just like a big part of the spirit of IFS from my lens is it's you know democratizing mental health in a way, making it accessible to people like you're talking about, because there's definitely certain experiences people have that really it's best if they can find a therapist to help guide them. But for a lot of people, if you do this work yourself, it can really make some profound shifts in your life. And if you have a good friend who can hold space for you, and you can do that peer to peer work with each other, it can really be supportive to people. And so love what you're doing. And I wish we had more time, maybe another half hour to talk, but we're kind of getting to the point where we need to wrap up. Before I ask you the last question I ask guests, where's a good place for people to get in touch with you? Where's a good place to direct people?
They can go to my website, tammysollenberger.com, and I have all the podcasts are there. And I have a link for consultation. And if people want to, this happened a couple of times where a group of people, either they're level 1 trained or they're waiting to get trained and they're therapists and they're kind of wanting to do some group work and kind of, this has happened to me probably 4 times where a group of people are like, there's 3 or 4 of us and we're wanting to like have, sort of learn and do some demos and do our own work. And so that's a really fun thing to do. So if people want to reach out to me, just go to my website, my book's there, the podcasts are there, all the information's there. So tammysollenberger.com.
Perfect. And link that in the show notes. And so the last question I generally ask people is, what's a message of hope you'd like to leave the listeners with today?
That's such a great question. My message of hope is we all have what we call this true self, this authentic self, or that's not what we have, but that's actually who we are. So what's available to us at all times is calm, curious, compassion, creative, clear-minded, connected. And that's available to us at all times. And that's, we've all forgotten, with our just past and childhood stuff or whatever it is, we've forgotten that that's who we are. That's the essence of who you are. And you can find that. You can have access to that. Go for a walk, go out to the woods, go do something that brings something that kind of stimulates that. And then just to remind yourself. And we can also find that when we work with our parts. When we work with our parts are often blocking that. So when we work with our parts, we have more space between us and them. And then we can really feel that a little bit more. And so that's the message of hope, is it's right here. It's right inside every single one, no matter what you've done, no matter who you are. That's who you are. You are this authentic, amazing, calm, connected self.
Oh. Well, that is a hopeful message, no matter what our external environment looks like, no matter how flooded we are with these parts at times. We all have experienced that self, and we all can access it. And that's so nice. That's awesome. All right. Well, Tammy, thanks so much for taking the time for being on the podcast, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.